Good evening. I'm Richard Waller, Executive Director of the University Museums at the University of Richmond. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the lecture and reception for our exhibition, Robert Taplin, Everything Imagined is Real, after Dante, in the Joel and Lila Harnett Museum of Art. We are delighted to have the sculptor Robert Taplin with us this evening to talk about his work. The exhibition and related programs are made possible in part with funds from the Lewis S. Booth Arts Fund. This evening, we are also celebrating 3 other new exhibitions: Structure and Gesture, abstract prints by Jack Torkoff; I Am in Between, Divisions of Self and Place in Art from the Harnett Print Study Center collection, and our annual student exhibition. I hope you will have a chance to see them during the reception this evening or come back to enjoy them. Everything Imagined is Real After Dante is a series of 9 sculptures by Robert Taplin that takes us on a very powerful journey as we walk through the exhibition. The artist was inspired by the 14th century iconic poem Dante's The Divine Comedy, and in particular his Inferno. There are 100 cantos in the total poem, with 34 cantos devoted to the Inferno. Taplin uses the first 9 cantos to follow Dante in his journey through the first 3 of the 9 circles of hell, led by the Roman poet Virgil. The artist creates his own version of the story by adding contemporary nuances and situations from our 21st century perspective, along with his own very personal references. Also on view are 5 wall-hung reliefs from his more recent series titled Here and There, and focused on rites and rituals of our own time. It is my great pleasure to introduce Robert Taplin. Robert is a sculptor living and working in New Haven, Connecticut. His background is in medieval studies and theater design. In fact, he earned his BA in medieval studies from Pomona College in Claremont, California in 1973. By the mid-1970s, he was creating and exhibiting his artwork. He has shown his work in both solo and group exhibitions, and is in the exhibition Suffering from Realness, currently on view at Mass MoCA. I think we should all take a trip up there to see that exhibition. He has completed several public commissions and received grants, mostly from the Connecticut Commission on the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. His artwork and his writings and reviews on sculpture have been featured in numerous publications, including Art in America, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. He has taught in graduate and undergraduate programs, most recently at Yale University and the Rhode Island School of Design. Robert will also give an exhibition walkthrough tomorrow afternoon, starting at 1:30, and I hope that you will be able to join us then for his gallery talk in the exhibition. The title of his talk this evening is Into the Dark Wood. Following the talk, we will have time for some questions, and then please join us in the Harnett Museum to see the exhibition and to enjoy the reception in the booth lobby. Please join me in welcoming Robert Taplin.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I'm delighted to be here. This show, the exhibition, which you're going to see, has been shown 3 or 4 times before, but it's never looked this good. This is exactly the way I'd always wanted it, and it's really ideal conditions because of the control of the light and the size of the gallery and everything else. So I'm really delighted. All right, I'm going to take a quick spin here through a little bit of background. And what I want to say is that I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, I read a book by Isaiah Berlin called The Roots of Romanticism. And it completely reoriented my ideas about what modernism is. I'd grown up as a young artist thinking about modernism as the 20th century phenomenon involved with the great 20th century artists that we were all thinking of, and of course the 19th century precedents. And my studies, the medieval studies and whatnot, I had really spent no time whatsoever looking at the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And the Roots of Romanticism lays out modernism as a sort of two-sided coin, with this rationalistic, scientific Enlightenment side that we're very familiar with, and then the anti-Enlightenment, what came to be called Romanticism, which was opposed to the Enlightenment. And I never really understood this. And as a youngster, I'd always thought Romanticism was a sort of, floppy, icky thing you didn't really want to have anything to do with, especially within the context of that, fervent mid-century modernism, David Smith and whatnot, that I admired so much. And so just for fun, I've put up here two characters who are paradigms of this two-sided modernism that I'm talking about. On the right there, we have François-Marie Darouet. We know him as Voltaire, who was the sort of classic 18th century rationalist, progressive, Enlightenment character. He was a poet, polemicist, essayist, known as a libertine. He was interested in sexual freedom, freedom of speech, mocking the traditional authorities of the church and the state with a view to supporting liberty. He was jailed in the Bastille. He was in exile some. He was an empiricist, interested in natural science, a devotee of Newton, friend of Franklin. So he's an icon of this sort of scientifically minded, practically engaged rationalism. Voltaire, those guys, their idea was that if we could just clear away all that superstition and religion and mythos and traditional thinking and all get on the same page with a sort of rational, logical way of looking at things, we could move forward. We'd all be on the same page and we could have real progress. So he's a universalist. He thinks that there are principles that apply everywhere to everybody. And if we could all just understand that, everything would be fine. Johann Gottfried Herder over here was having none of it. He's a German student of Kant, critic of Kant, advisor to Goethe. He wrote a great book on sculpture called Plastik. And he defended the haptic, the sense of touch as a way to understand sculpture. Which was unusual. In the Enlightenment rational idea, the optical sense of art was what mattered, obviously, because it was open and apparent and intelligible, and touch is irrational and sexual and obscure. But Herder said, no, that's how you have to think about sculpture in terms of touch. And so he's a cultural relativist, right? He thinks there are no universal principles. Culture comes up from underneath. It's local. It's personal. He's a sort of a founder of anthropology. He's the first folklorist, really. He makes a book of folk songs, folk leader, in 1774. So Herder's interested in myth, fairy tale, religion, all this stuff that those rational Enlightenment people thought was a bunch of hooey. And so Berlin's big point is that he's anti-systematic. He doesn't think there's one answer. He thinks there are many ways to approach things. And he's a defender of religion, although he was a man of the Enlightenment. He was a secular analyst of the Bible. And he had these ideas about sentiment before cognition, what we would call emotional intelligence, the idea that you had to feel it before you understood it. You had to have a motivation, a reason to understand something. All right, so that's just a sort of quick layout. And of course, these kind of polarity paradigms don't really work out very well. There's lots of contradictions in there. And the rationalists were interested in things that would strictly fall into the romantic area and vice versa. Nevertheless, for me, it was a useful new idea of what modernism was, this conflict between these two ways of looking at things. All right, so this is me in the 70s making modernist sculpture, abstract sculpture. I was interested in Calder, de Souvre, Ricky, things like that. And these are big kinetic pieces, completely geometric. And that's kind of where I started. But somewhere around 1976 or 77, a friend of mine and I got together, and we did another project together. He was a poet, Daniel Wolfe, and we did a set of sculptures that were called the 9 Views of New Haven. And they were hand-cranked, what we called viewers. You looked into them like a peep box, and they had moving parts, and they had a sequential little ballad in there that Daniel wrote, and the refrain of the ballad was, "This is the place it happened here." And they were set out around New Haven as if they were little memorials to the events of a love affair, which may have been completely imaginary. You weren't sure. And so we thought of the guy who made these, our imaginary fellow, as the viewer maker who wanted to memorialize this love affair. And so the cool thing, this one on the left, the thing I like, where's the sculpture? Right? It's that funny thing hanging on the light pole there. They were made to just merge with the city environment. That's the interior of one that was called Kings. Here's one that was called Dixwell Avenue. And they had a funny, some of them had a funny, this one had a physical pun to it. You came up, you looked through the peephole, you started pumping on the handle, hunkada, 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 hunkada. And the spokes start going around, right? You're looking through a bicycle wheel, so they blur. The light on the little, over the room came on. And there's this little guy lying on a bed back there, and it's scribbled on the wall, "This is the place it happened here." And then after a while, a window shade came up and blocked your view, like you were looking through the bathroom window or something. And the poem was on the window shade, and it said, it said, "She and I, we'd giddy up all around and stop for air. And just when I thought I had her there, she'd ask if I owned a car." So it was this, funny, vernacular ballad kind of thing. Here's one. This was called Bus Stop. This was cool because this one actually replaced the bus stop. The title of this piece was Bus Stop. That's the real bus stop sign. We took the bus stop sign down and put it on the sculpture. So these people were waiting for the bus. And there was a little scene in there of people going back and forth in a nighttime city with stars going over. Then after a while, the moon seemed to come up, and the poem was on the moon. And it said, "I was standing here while the city passed. In one of its windows, I saw her face. I rode the buses all day long. She was every place." So the romantic girl begins to just become the city. So obviously, this was a completely different kind of art from the geometric stuff I'd been making. This whole set of sculptures went down to New York under the auspices of the Public Art Fund. We built an arcade. It said, this was on Union Square in Lower Manhattan. It said, "Welcome to New Haven." And then there was another little sign in there that said, "Inside this city, there's another city." And the 9 of them were all there. And they worked very hard for a month. And we used to catch kids in there charging 25 cents, and we'd have to chase them off. And this is 1978 in New York. Things were pretty rough, but it was fun. It survived. All right, so there I was, the late 70s, early 80s, and I was like a split personality. I had this geometric stuff over here, and this kind of romantic, narrative, vernacular thing over here. So I started over again, kind of, and I went back to the kind of constructivist tradition, but instead of making things with moving parts, I started making these constructivist sculptures, but that had a sort of hidden narratives and landscape elements in them. It was called Celila Falls. This one was called Salisbury Plain. Started to be a figure. Now, in the modernist vocabulary that I'd grown up with, volume was an absolute no-go, right? The sort of constructivists, you either indicated a volume axially with an internal line or an edge, or planarly with a silhouette or a side, but you didn't make a volume. That was 19th century, and we didn't do that. So these things had these sort of axial indications of maybe a figure. I was very interested in the monument to Apollinaire that Picasso made. I don't know if you know that piece, but then at a certain point I started to kind of forge on the steel and start to thicken up and let the figure emerge out of the landscape. This is a piece called Chihuahua. So it's a double image, something I worked with later. There's both an antelope and a woman hoeing, and they share a front set of legs. And I started to think of this as if I was starting to put the flesh back on modern sculpture. This was still very constructivist. It's tripodic, angular, stands on the ground. There's no base. But I was reintroducing elements that had been banished from modern sculpture. Narrative, figure, image. And I was still making it direct, hammering this stuff. Julio Gonzalez was sort of the precedent. Then around 1985, I went all in. I said, okay, I'm going to bring the volume all the way back up to a fleshy, full volume. But these were still forged steel, so this is not made in a traditional figurative way of making a volume out of clay and then molding it and casting it. This is hammering out sheets of steel. And again, Julio Gonzalez, who was the guy who worked with Picasso and taught him how to weld, was the sort of precedent. He'd done some of this on a smaller scale in the 20s, but never at a full. So these were life-size, and this is starting to dive heavily into the surrealist dream world, right? And of course, the surrealists were the romantics of 20th century modernism, right? They were the ones who were interested in the irrational, the dream, the mythos, as opposed to the geometric constructivists, the Mondrian, the Kandinsky, whatever. And that also was still slightly forbidden territory. Surrealism is something that makes people, sort of dyed-in-the-wool modernists are kind of queasy about surrealism. But I got very interested in this dream, so this is called the Coals. And then it sort of took off for a while. These are all life-size, forged steel. This is called the Source on the left. Walk Like a Man on the right. The one on the right is a sort of three-generational thing. The guy with the kid on his shoulders he can't see because the kid's got his hands over his eyes, and he's kind of dragging Grandpa along in the picnic basket. He's back there in pieces. The big head casserole, an enormous genital sausage, sort of bottle of gin blood, So he's sort of the reliquary. He's sort of dragging him along in sections there in the back. So it's a wild, nightmarish, surreal dream image. Okay, so by this time I had a partner and we started casting bronze. I said, all right, if we're going to go back to actually modeling and everything, I started modeling things in wax. And again, wax in the 19th century was sort of the romantic material. All the Degas, who was, again, a sort of where does Degas fit in that romantic rationalist paradigm? Well, he's kind of both and neither, right? But The idea of the responsiveness of modeling with wax was something that really appealed to that romantic sensibility. And it is amazing because it's something you can just handle, turn it upside down, stretch it, bend it, push it. It's very fluid and responsive. And I got interested, those big figures were life-size. I got interested in this idea of the votive figure, right? The thing you can hold in your hand. The little thing you leave at the altarpiece, because, in the altar, because you're hoping the god or the goddess is going to do what you want them to do for you. Down in the valley there on the left, and if I were you and you were me on the right. And then that naturally led into the idea of making tableaus. Well, what if I got two figures? And then I got interested in something that went on into later work in this double. The double became kind of a obsessive motif through a whole lot of what I did. And part of the idea, this is an early one, burning monk, drowning baby. It's only about this big, it's tiny. And the idea is, two time spaces existing simultaneously in the same sculpture. These two things might have been two disasters maybe happening at the same time in completely different places. The little baby who's fallen in the river and the monk burning himself. And then, it expanded. The idea, well, what if the figures begin to relate to each other? And I got very interested in photography at this point. So this is Diane Arbus at a nudist colony. And so the couple on the right is a quite careful version of a couple from a Diane Arbus photograph. She took that picture of that couple holding hands, and he's got his cigarettes in his other hand, and then I, put her in there because she wrote this wonderful introduction in the Aperture catalog about what it was like to go to the nudist colony, and that everybody was dressed to the nines, she said, little necklace and some nice sandals and a bracelet and then so there she is, this sort of crazy New York Jewish lady with these sort of healthy American nudists, I just thought, God, how strange, but sort of beautiful. And then those figures were still very small, 6 inches. They started to get a little bit bigger. One unfriendly reviewer saw some of these and said, they're about G.I. Joe scale, which was, I have to say, true. But these were, again, I started to look, this is sort of the 80s, the sort of media scavenger world, and I started getting really interested in photojournalism. It's like, wow, these guys and women are out there taking these really kind of amazing pictures, and some of them were very, very beautiful. And then there it is, just right in your newspaper and the magazine. It's not an art gallery thing, but they're extraordinary. And so this is called Burn. I thought about what happens if you crop a sculpture the way you crop a photograph. What's not important just goes off the edge. Yeah. And then tabloids, right? You look at a tabloid. This is called, boy, it's been a long time. What is Stunt? It's called Stunt. 2 little 6-inch figures. The guy shooting, one guy's got the 2 cinder blocks on his chest, and the other guy, he does the William Tell, and the cinder blocks blow apart. Well, this is from a tabloid image, something in the New York Post or something. Starting to mess with polychrome. What happens if you colored the figures? Okay, so these are mine, as you no doubt know. So that's where I was sort of getting to in the 80s. And it was the era of neo-expressionists. There were other people my age who were starting to mess with imagery. And there were sort of 2 wings of it. I would put Kiki Smith on the top left there in the sort of romantic wing. She was interested in dream and myth and the irrational and whatnot. And And Koons down here was a much cooler, more analytical, critical mentality of some sort at the beginning. I'm afraid that didn't last. But in the early years with Jeff Koons, he really was, it was sort of incisive in a certain way. And of course, he didn't make anything himself. It was all farmed out. For me, it fell into that sort of rationalist, cool approach. And then this guy started turning up, about Stefan Balkenhol. And these were some of the first sort of full-scale figurative things I started to see in the New York galleries, German. And it turned out that Jeff Wall, Canadian, wrote a brilliant essay about these in 1987, which I didn't see till some years later. But he said, this is a counter-experimental form, a critique of the experimental forms of the 70s. In other words, this was somebody who was standing up and saying, all that wild stuff that went on in the 70s may or may not pan out. What if I just make this figure? And of course, it had a lot of romantic aspects to it. It has sort of a folk arty feeling to it. The identification of the figure with the wood, the tree that it's made out of, is a classic sort of romantic thing. But it also had this, what Wall, to me, brilliantly called, Balkenhol sort of qualified as an iconophobe. Somebody who's actually kind of scared of the power of the imagery and feels that, the real iconophobes were people like Cindy Sherman, who felt, right, that representation, the image, is inherently flawed. It's usually a lie. It's a fraud of some sort. It's usually something that's being used to manipulate you in one way, politically or in terms of advertising or whatever, and that the artist's job is to undermine that, to expose the fraud, to display the fact that representation is a manipulation, and an illegitimate manipulation. And so Balkenhol is sort of, somewhere in between there. And Wall brilliantly said, that's me. These things are like a figure, like a guy who's been in the hospital. And he's just gotten out of the hospital and he's not strong enough to really do anything yet. He couldn't take action, but he's sort of survived. And that was like a perfect description of what happened to figurative art in the 20th century. It had a near-death experience. It was almost wiped out. And then it was as if figurative art was like stepping out of the hospital, kind of tentatively. It's like, is that going to work? Is anybody going to accept that? So I thought that was brilliant. On the other hand, I also felt like this romantic, surrealist dream world I'd been working in, both for myself and also sort of the world of the art world, it was sort of coming to a conclusion. And I felt like I needed to pull out of the sort of mythic mists and find something more objective, more rational, more analytical, more observational, take the time to look at somebody else instead of myself. And this was sort of the transitional piece. I also changed my technique. I went back to a traditional form of modeling in clay and casting. These are cast in concrete and cement. And these are exact half-scale figures. It's called the body is a frail leaf, but the mind is a fortress. So this was transitional for me in that they're now observational figures, but it still has this crazy, surreal feeling to it and a sort of hidden narrative. But then they started to get more objective and rational, still working with this idea of the double, the sort of split vision, asking you to sort of think about two things at once. So in these pieces, I now brought a model into the studio. I was working in a traditional way. I'm looking at you, I'm not looking at me anymore. I'm looking at you. It's a form of a portrait. The figure, again, is exact half scale. The head is exactly twice life size. And then, of course, the table and you, the viewer, are life size. So I started to get very interested in the idea of positioning the viewer. How does the viewer stand in relation to the sculpture, both emotionally, physically, intellectually? Where does the sculpture put you? And it puts you right in the middle in this case. And so you get a sort of a zoom effect as you go from that huge head down to the little head of the figure. And you have to assemble it for yourself in a way. So the sort of final product isn't really there in a sense, it's up here. So there were a bunch of these, all the nails pointed in, Bob. The presence of the figures and the heads got very strong. So they were kind of undeniable and quite confrontational, very frontal. You stood right in front of the thing and looked at it. You could walk around it, but it was very much in front of you. And then I tried, instead of the scale split, just twice, hide it twice. And again, is it a sequence? Did she have her clothes on and then she took them off? Are they twins? Two people just sitting there next to each other? And then this idea, which had also been a feature of the earlier pieces, that one element always had their eyes closed and the other element open. The eyes open. So one part of the sculpture looked back at you, and the other did not. And so this was this whole problem, again, of how does the sculpture position you, the viewer? You're looking at it, it's looking back at you. And again, a sort of foundational text for me was Michael Fried's Absorption and Theatricality, in which he said, the portrait is always theatrical. The portrait is aware of you, the audience. And then typically a genre painting, the depiction is of people who are absorbed in their own activity and are not paying any attention to you. So this is another dichotomy that interested me very much. Does the sculpture address you or does it ignore you? And so the simplest version of that was eyes open, eyes closed. And then this is also the whole problem of the female nude, the male gaze, right? And so in this case, right, the girl with her clothes off is very clinical. I mean, she looks like she's waiting to see the gynecologist. And the girl with the clothes on is the sort of sexy, dreamy one. So I was trying to, handle that a little bit. How that works, the gaze. All right, and then this led onward into, at the same time I started picking up this problem of the tableau, although again in a much cooler, more objective way, cast in white. This is called the reenactment. So it's very removed, very cold, very, very still, but with this weird narrative element of the two lawyers trying to explain how the accident happened. The test. So, and these are pretty much absorption, right? I mean, this is pretty much nobody paying attention to you. It's all in there. And that's classic genre art, genre sculpture. Okay, so those developments all started to finally kind of come together for me around 2000 when I started working on this big project called the 5 Outer Planets. And this was shown in Wesleyan and then down in Smack Mellon in New York. This is when it was in Smack Mellon. And these were 5 doubled figures in descending scales. Let's see if there's, okay, those are, I'm going to go up and then I'll back up again. Okay, there they all are. Well, no, there, you still can't see all of them. This was at Grounds for Sculpture 5 or 6 years ago. The idea was that it was, I looked at the names of the planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. They're a family group from Greco-Roman mythology. So it turns out that Jupiter, big boss guy in charge, Saturn's his father, Uranus is his grandfather, Neptune and Pluto are his brothers. This was back when Pluto was still a planet. He got demoted shortly after that, which was always a problem. But anyway, so I tried to crossbreed the Greco-Roman story, which is this terrible story of the succession of generations between male sons and fathers, where the son has to keep overcoming the father by just destroying him or tying him up or castrating him or whatever. And take that crazy story and sort of crossbreed it with actual physical characteristics of the planets. They've got a light side and a dark side. And okay, that's Pluto way up high, Saturn way down low, Neptune flying over on the right. There's Neptune, and then here's Uranus coming along, tumbling along on the right. Okay, and that's Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus tumbling along. So there were things like, Uranus actually does tumble. The planet tumbles instead of rotating this way. And Uranus is also the one who is castrated by his father, Saturn. So he's in this, terrible doubled over yin-yang pose. So this was the first time I sort of felt like I was getting it all on the same page, the sort of crossbreeding between somewhat objective, rational things and this crazy mythological story. It also was an attempt to give you a feeling of what an actual cult statue would have been like. When you walked into a temple, the temple of Athena or Zeus in the classical era, and there's this dark temple with this massive statue in there that's all made out of, ivory and gold and everything. What was that actual cult feeling? And when you're in this dark room with these guys, it gives you just a little bit of that. This was amazing. Smack Mellon had a 50-foot ceiling. It was an old spice factory. So when you walked in down below, Jupiter was right in front of you, and Pluto was up 40 feet up in the air there. And they are in descending sizes that roughly mirror the size of the planets, but also create a false perspective. So they look even farther away than they are as you go back. That's Pluto back up on the right. Okay, so this was a show down in New Jersey, and it was a fun show because I got to show everything I'd been doing. The planets, Punch, which is this other series I'm going to show you, and the Dante series, which is in here at Richmond. So here's one of the small Punch sculptures up above the planets. Punch makes a public confession. And this started out looking at, I'd always been interested in puppetry and the sort of the whole tradition of a non-naturalistic narrative depiction. Then I saw a fabulous exhibit at the Met that was the entire set of Tiepolo's drawings of Punch, called Un divertimento per i ragazzi, an amusement for the children, which was done in the Napoleonic era, and it was done by Tiepolo, the big Tiepolo's son. Giambattista, who did all the Venetian frescoes, this was his son. And they're fabulous, beautiful ink and wash drawings of Punch thrown in, the Venetian Punch, he's in a carnival Punch mask and everything, a whole society of them sort of thrown into the contemporary genre world of the early 19th century. And I thought, this is fabulous, I can do this. I'm just going to put Punch into my contemporary world. So that's Punch at 10 inches high. This is Punch enlarged to 9 feet, making his public confession. This is up at Masmoka right now. And this all became a kind of, this interest of, it's objective to some extent and satirical, but it has what I call a sort of vernacular classicism. It's a familiar or it feels like a familiar vocabulary, that it's something you sort of feel like you know about. It doesn't seem strange stylistically, although it's quite carefully done. But the way it's handled in the subject matter and what's going on can be pretty strange. So this is Masmoka. There are these 4 pieces there. So this is one of the ones that's Punch does a magic trick. So Punch is the classic trickster, rascal figure who sort of gets away with things. I always say he's both a figure of sort of envy and opprobrium. I mean, you sort of hate him, but you kind of envy him. He's sort of free, but he's kind of scary. You don't know what he's going to do. He is an artist. He's an actor. He's part of a troupe. And this all comes out of the Commedia dell'arte, which were the sort of traveling troupes of improvisational actors. It's kind of ancien regime. It's like before the French Revolution, right? This is, and that struck a chord with me because I think we're in a somewhat similar situation. This is Punch scratches burrows ears. He relates a little bit better to the animal world than he does. And I sort of invented, to some extent, well, it's in Tiepolo too, but I kind of concentrated to some extent on this idea of the young Punch. What was Punch's childhood like? Well, he had a burro who he, I think, liked better than most anybody else he knew. He's scratching his ears. Punch stopped at the border, all right? And this guy, he's got his, he's crossing the border with puppets and juggling things, and he's been stopped. Now, these things are up at Masmoka now, and everybody's saying, oh, this is so contemporary. And I said, well, that was done 10 years ago. As were most of the small maquette versions of these things. So they were predictive, not descriptive. And these are some more of the small ones. Punch goes to a premiere. All right, so you've got the upright Canadian Mountie there and sort of Pamela Anderson or somebody, and Punch is trying to get in on the action. Again, taken right from a tabloid of Pamela Anderson arriving at the premiere with in that case, she had a Mountie on both sides. So Punch replaced one of the Mounties. The young Punch watches TV with the maids. Punch had a privileged but maybe lonely childhood. Punch goes on parade. This is one of the first ones where Judy turns up. He's like, pull, Judy! And, they're trying to scare up a little business. He's in his poodle outfit with his poodle snout and his tail, and the trained dogs are coming along. And so it's kind of portrait of an artist as a trained dog. Okay, there were some big versions of these. This was the young Punch goes shopping with his mother. This was down at the Aldrich Museum in Connecticut. And this is kind of cool because I went back to my business from the planets of the internal illumination. This thing looks like it's marble or stone in the daytime, but it's actually fiberglass. And as it becomes dusk, it starts to get this weird glow. Oh, there it is. It's now at the New Britain Museum. But then it starts to burn, and it turns into this big nightlight. So again, they go from seeming very solid to being a complete membrane, something that's quite insubstantial. This is Punch is homeless. This was down at in Connecticut for a summer show. He's crossing this square of AstroTurf, which my wife, who's here, gets credit for. That was her idea. And I said, oh, come on. And then I thought, that's a really good idea. So he crosses a piece of AstroTurf. He was down at PAFA, and this was just fabulous. I don't know if you've ever been to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, but it's this crazy pastiche building with all this decorative stuff and lots of 19th century sculpture, big white marble sculptures. This thing, of course, is foam. And he was crossing the AstroTurf in front of a 20-foot long Benjamin West painting of the Humiliation of Christ, who's over here on the left here, and everybody's exclaiming. I mean, it just looked great. I mean, that painting is 20 feet long, and Punch was just kind of moving by. This was when he was down at the Grounds for Sculpture. He looks like he's headed for the dollar store to see what he can pick up. And the thing about Punch that's important is, again, he's not looking for your pity. He's not, he's just taking care of business. It's not, oh dear, Punch is homeless. Punch is homeless, and he's just taking care of it. So it puts the viewer in a slightly queasy spot in terms of how you're supposed to relate to these things. Okay, so now this is Dante, which we're going to go see, and I'm not going to say a whole lot about this because I want you to go in and look at the exhibit. But this is the third big project I've done in the last 20 years. The Punch is sort of ongoing. I returned to this idea of working from a text, a poem, the way I'd done with the viewers with Daniel, 40 years ago. But I took Dante, which I had studied in school, and I extracted 9 short verses, or verses from the first 9 cantos, which are on the wall in there as you go through it. And then I used those as a springboard to make this set of 9 sculptures, many of which are dioramas. They're all tableaus of some sort or another. The things I will say is it's important. One of the things I took from the poem is the fact that in the poem, The Inferno, sometimes you see Dante as a character in the poem. You see he's depicted what he's doing. And then other times you see what Dante sees. He's not there. And that's mirrored in the way the sculptures are presented. And I kind of jettisoned all the metaphysics, the theology, and kind of brought it back down to to earth, so to speak. And there's a lot of reversal. When you're in the circle that's supposed to be the gluttonous, the people you're depicting that are depicted are probably starving. And so there's a lot of that where things have been turned upside down. So the feeling is the other important thing is that, Dante, when he was walking around in Ravenna at the end of his life, kids apparently used to go up and touch his shirt. I touched the man who went to hell. Well, now, in our rational modern way, we say, well, no, he didn't go to hell. He imagined hell, right? And he imagined it very clearly. And my Dante series has the similar setup where it's about a person who's never seen a war trying to imagine a war as this flood of imagery comes to us every day. What's it like to be in a war zone? I've never been there. So again, there's a somewhat uneasy feeling of where you stand, both where the character Dante in my series stands and where you stand, and you get drawn into it that way, I think. And then just a couple of little, I don't know, sort of anecdotal things. Again, Dante actually wrote a book called The Eloquence of the Vernacular. And I've taken that very much to heart, the idea that the vernacular, this sort of apparent, familiar vocabulary, something that doesn't seem strange or unusual or anything, can indeed be the vehicle for the unknown, the mysterious, the compelling. A great deal of contemporary art is resistant to interpretation, right? That was Sontag's great essay against interpretation. It's set up so that you are sort of being denied the chance to make your interpretation of it. And that's sort of what makes it art in a certain realm of contemporary art. This isn't like that. I'm sort of working a completely opposed angle. And then just one other little anecdotal thing. When my grandfather, who I never met, he died the year I was born, he was very involved with the Wadsworth Athenaeum in the 30s. And there was a big exhibition of Hopper's watercolors in 1935. And he was a prosperous, even though it was the Depression, he was a prosperous insurance executive in Hartford. And he bought 4 Hopper watercolors. And through a set of unusual circumstances, 2 of those watercolors, he had 6 kids, my mother was one of them. 2 of those watercolors ended up in our house when I was 10 or 11, and they were there through my youth. And they made a tremendous impression on me, and Hopper did kind of nail a certain idea for me of what an American artist might be. And I think you'll see that in there. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do, I did go and learn Italian so that I could read Dante. And so the translations of the little sections of the poem that are in there are my translations. And I tried to make them very vernacular because that was Dante's idea. He was writing in Italian, which at that point was the vernacular. A serious poem was supposed to be written in Latin. And so it was sort of as if he was, writing about the Inferno in rap or something. I mean, he was really dropping down into the vernacular, and he felt that was, the eloquence of the vernacular. He was confident about that. And his Italian, in fact, became sort of Florentine Italian. It's what people still speak. So this is my translation of just the first 9 verses of the Inferno. In the middle of the journey of this our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, and I couldn't see the way out. Oh, how to say what that was like is a hard thing. A wood so wild and savage and dense that when I think of it again, my heart begins to race. It was so bitter that death could hardly be worse. But to show the good things I found there, I will speak of the other things I discovered. All right, thank you. I did put a couple more in here. Yeah, there's Hopper. So I don't know if there are any questions. Maybe you brought the house lights up. It's all perfectly apparent, right? Speak up if...
Plans for the future for you? Any plans, projects?
Yeah, the Punch series is ongoing, and you'll see in the exhibit there are 5 newer pieces. These Dante pieces are 10 years old. So there are 5 pieces that have been completed in the last year that are on the first wall as you go in, that are from this series I'm calling Here and there will eventually be 8 of them. And they use both the sort of some of the approach and the kind of imagery from the Dante pieces, and are sort of extending it into a different format. So yeah, those are the two things that are on for right now. Yeah.
I don't understand what these things are made of.
All the figures are cast in resin. They're all modeled in wax, molded, cast in urethane resin. And the boxes, the theaters, and I don't know if I've got one that are just wood. You know, I don't have one here that shows but you'll see when you're going to see the exhibit. They, the sort of theatrical surround, and they are sort of like puppet shows, like a puppet theater, or some of them are just tables, or just painted wood. And then the backgrounds, I mean, that's made out of everything: wood, plaster, styrofoam. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh.
What brought you to Richmond?
What brought me to Richmond? Well, Richard Waller brought me to Richmond. No, Richard and I have been in touch for years. I don't know really where we first, I mean, maybe I sent you something or you sent me something, but it's been so long I don't remember. And we sort of been in touch. And then, the moment came where I thought maybe we could do this. And I got in contact with Richard and he said, yeah, let's. This fall. And I went, what, are you crazy? So, yeah, pleased to be here. I mean, it really is exactly the way I'd hoped to see it. And it's really the first time I've seen it that way. Anybody else? Good? Well, let's go see the show.